over to you, Ali. I'll let you introduce today's webinar.
Great, thanks very much. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll just give everyone a minute or so to log in. We really appreciate you making some time for us in the lead up to Easter, which is obviously a really busy period. Today's quite the auspicious day, being the 31st of March, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Just some housekeeping comments. We would encourage everyone to post questions, which we'll get to at the end of the session, and very much hope that you enjoy the exploration of where we're going to go with insolvencies for the rest of this year. All right, so if we've got, we've still got some people joining, so I'll give everyone a few more seconds. But I might start.
You can do an extended introduction.
An extended introduction sounds good. So I'd really like to welcome everybody today to the Creditor Watch webinar. It's D-Day for insolvencies. The business community has long had this day in its sights as an important line in the sand for the COVID-19 recovery, and there are obviously quite a few reasons for this. The first being the end of the federal government's job seeker wage subsidy, which finished on Sunday, and today is the day where leniency provisions for insolvent trading measures finished. So back in March 2020, which seems, I'm sure, to all of us like a lifetime ago, the federal government introduced a temporary moratorium on insolvent trading, and those rules allowed businesses that were solvent prior to that date to continue trading without the threat of recrimination for directors, acknowledging the very difficult trading environment of the time. These rules were effectively extended at the end of last year to allow smaller businesses with debts of $1 million or less to engage an insolvency practitioner to negotiate with creditors to continue trading. On the 1st of January, as many of you will know, a simplified small business insolvency regime came into force, known as the Corporations Amendment Corporate Insolvency Reform Act. And that legislation is designed to make it easier for small business to restructure or to liquidate their operations. So that's the backdrop for today's discussion, and we're going to have a look at where insolvency trends are now and where to from here. So let me introduce our esteemed panelists for today. So we've got Patrick Coghlan, who's the CEO of Creditor Watch. Patrick was one of Creditor Watch's first 3 employees and has been instrumental in shaping the business to where it is today. He also sits on ASIC's Business Advisory Panel. Good morning, Pat.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
Thank you. And we also have Jason Preston, who's the chairman of specialist advisory firm McGrathNicol. Jason has more than 20 years experience in restructuring and insolvency and has provided advice to some of the most important turnarounds in Australia. Good morning, Jason. Oh, I think we need to unmute you, Jason. Let me know if... I think that's a bit better. Good morning. How are you, Jason?
Thank you. Good. Thank you for having me.
And we also have Jason's colleague, Kathy Suzu, who's McGrathNicol's partner in restructuring. And Kathy has 19 years experience in independent business and diagnostic reviews in the public and private sectors. She's also an expert in turnaround planning, cash management and operational restructuring, and of course insolvency administration, both here and in the UK. Good morning to you, Kathy.
Thanks, Ali. Good morning all. It's a pleasure to be here.
And finally, we're very fortunate to have Andrew Batch, who's the CFO of LINX Cargo Care Group, who has been working across services, construction and engineering in a variety of senior finance roles. Good morning, Andrew.
Morning, Ali.
So let's kick off by asking you, Patrick, about insolvency numbers. So obviously insolvency figures necessarily fell off a cliff last year. Where are they at the moment?
So what we've seen, we obviously release our business risk review on a monthly basis, and a big number that's obviously been the popular one for the last 12 months has been administrations or insolvencies. They, on average, were probably down between sort of 40 and 50% if you compared, 2020 months to the 2019 equivalents, and that continued the whole way pretty much through 2020. How have we started this year? Well, there's a big jump, a headline jump from Jan to Feb of 61%, but ultimately, if you compared, I should say, Feb 2020 to Feb 2021, we're still down almost 50%. So we're nowhere near where we need to be. To put it in perspective for you, generally there's about, call it 8,000 to 9,000 administrations on an annual basis, and we were down around that 5,000 mark, and we're still down through Jan and Feb and March as well. So plenty to come through.
So not a return to normal as yet.
Not yet, not yet. I think we're going to see a sort of sustained increase back up to pre-COVID numbers, particularly now that the insolvency protections and most importantly, JobKeeper has come to an end.
Last year, there was a lot of commentary about there being a tsunami of insolvencies. Was that just a media headline, or could we see maybe from April onwards a real flood of insolvencies hit the market?
Look, I think hindsight's a beautiful thing to look back and go, oh, they were just grabbing media headlines. But, you've also got the likes of Deloitte Access Economics and Treasury coming out with numbers through last year saying, there's potential for 250,000 businesses to go into administration if, we turned off insolvent trading laws or the protections from insolvent trading and also JobKeeper. So, if you were to compare where we were most of the way through last year compared to where we are today, it is certainly chalk and cheese. And I don't even think in a best case scenario, anyone really expected us to be where we are. So those numbers, those predictions were certainly right back then. And it's fantastic that we haven't had to experience anything like that.
Yes, we're certainly very fortunate. We do expect, though, there to be an uptick in insolvency numbers, and I'm interested in your perspective on what that means for business confidence.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is where it's really important, is the confidence in business, but also consumer confidence as well. So we will see an uptick. That is naturally going to happen. Whether it's going to be quite steep or just that sustained increase back to pre-COVID numbers, we'll start to get a really good sense of that from probably late April onwards. I don't think we'll see numbers, start straight away next week increasing. And I think what's important is that they're put into perspective around where we were in 2019, for example. Comparing it to 2020 doesn't do anyone any favors. We don't want to, create fear, and we want businesses and consumers to have confidence in the economy and where we're going. There's plenty of confidence out there. Businesses are starting to hire again. They're starting to invest. There's record number of or a record amount of liquidity and savings both in consumer and corporate wallets at the moment, which is fantastic. But yes, we will ultimately see an increase in the number of administrations taking place, and we just need to obviously keep that into perspective with where we were before COVID hit.
Just looking at, I guess, some sector-specific numbers, through last year, one of the worst performing sectors was health, which in terms of payment times, which seems counterintuitive given demand for their services. Why were their payment times so slow, and where do you expect payment times in that sector to go from here?
Yeah, it is. It's a really interesting one. And, when we sort of look back over 2020 in particular, and we talk about, I guess, the entrepreneurial spirit that came out of, alcohol makers turning gin into, hand sanitizer, one of my sort of favorite analogies to use. I think one of the other things to come out of it is this: how is the healthcare sector performing so poorly? Why are they paying bills so late? And the fact is, everything in that healthcare sector became COVID focused. So if you weren't dealing with COVID, essentially, if you weren't a frontline worker in the hospital, assisting people from a COVID perspective, then you were forgotten about. So you think about surgeries were either put on hold or totally scrapped for a long period of time. You had this huge focus on the health of people and doing testing and supplies for tests and just totally COVID dominated. All of the other parts of the health sector were forgotten about, essentially, and as a result, they've seen huge reductions in their own revenue and their own focus, and even government spend and support in those sectors. So while COVID is certainly a health pandemic, it's actually not decimated, but put a huge amount of pressure on the rest of the healthcare sector. So we're quite confident that we'll start to see an improvement in that space, but it will take some time to recover from that.
I'm also interested in your perspective on payment times in the construction sector, which also tends to be a bellwether for the economy in general. What are we seeing in terms of payment times there, and where do you expect it to go from here?
Yeah, look, typically they are one of our riskier industries that we identify, and I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. It's a tough industry, and it is often fraught with large collapses that we've certainly heard about. And there's a couple of them in the press at the moment, but they actually performed unbelievably well through 2020. I think from people working from home and realizing they're not spending money on a trip, or looking at a bathroom or a kitchen and going, I really need to make changes to this. I'm sick of looking at it every day. That ground roots investment all the way through to larger projects which weren't really affected continued, and they actually performed really well. We have seen an increase through Jan and Feb. Now this is quite typical. It's quite seasonal. The fact is that jobs slow right down through late December and into January, and we know that businesses aren't around to either demand payment or make the payment. So it's from both sides, both an AP and an AR side. So I'm quite confident in the construction industry. There's plenty of support from the government, but it is certainly definitely one to watch. As you said, it's a bellwether for the health of the economy.
Thanks, Patrick. Now, turning to you, Jason, as the head of one of Australia's top insolvency and restructuring practices, what's happening in your business at the moment? I guess it's an exciting time for you guys.
It's been an interesting journey. There's no doubt. If I look back a year from now, just over when everyone went into lockdown, I think the tsunami concept was very real. I mean, the phone was running hot and we were all wondering how we were going to deal with it all. And the reality is that response of JobKeeper, insolvent trading relief, bank support, ATO support, absolutely counter that, and that's reflected in the statistics that we've just been talking about. So the net of all that has been, broadly speaking, restructuring has been quiet for the last 12 months. We have still seen activity in certain sectors that just have fundamental structural challenges, and so even that rising tide of support hasn't sort of covered up all the cracks. And so we have seen some restructuring activity in things like energy, a little in retail, obviously aviation, tourism, construction. So there has still been some activity, but it's certainly been relatively quiet. What we've seen instead is management boards more focused on things like cyber risk, operational risk, or transactions and opportunities because of the liquidity that's around.
I'm interested in your perspective on, or the difference you've seen in your business now compared to the GFC when there were an awful lot of insolvencies.
Yeah, I mean, it's chalk and cheese. I mean, the GFC, obviously, the fundamental issue there was as a lack of credit, lack of money being available in the system very quickly. And so there was a lot of insolvencies that occurred because fundamentally there was a liquidity problem. We've seen the opposite here. We've seen lots and lots of liquidity, and in some sectors we've seen a boost in revenue as well, where there's just more money around. Where we are seeing some stress is where, just because of the nature of, for example, lockdowns and things like that, that certain sectors are exposed to a fundamental drop in revenue, and they can't overcome that. So very different, very different.
So where do you see things going from here in terms of insolvencies and how it might affect your business?
Yeah, look, I think obviously we're seeing this tide come out a bit now with the insolvent trading provisions, reverting back to where they were, with creditors now able to enforce statutory demands on the more normal time period rather than the extended one, with JobKeeper coming to an end. There is still a lot of support out there from banks, for example, and also I think from the ATO. But I think we're going to see more of a return to normal, and businesses are going to be faced with looking at what their sort of new level of operation and revenue looks like, what their cost base looks like, what the sort of legacy creditors are that they've built up, and having to deal with that. Whereas in reality, for the last 12 months, for many of them, they've been able to just ignore that. So I think we'll see a return to a more normal level of activity during the course of this year.
Looking on a sectoral basis, will there be winners and losers, and what will they be?
I think so. I think you still come back. There's still the underlying structural challenges that we've been able to perhaps ignore a bit. So I think, retail, we know retail's going through a great transition. That was playing out before COVID. COVID's accelerated that to some extent, but there's been a great level of support. So I think, we'll see retailers back over time having to deal with those structural challenges. I think construction's really interesting, and picking up what Pat was saying. I mean, we tend to see stress in construction, strangely enough, when the sector's busy, because they're on slim margins, costs go up, they're hard to recover because there's only so many people in the economy in the sector, but demand is up, and they often get their working capital wrong. So I think we'll see, and in fact we have seen some fallout around construction and property, and I think we'll see more of that going forward. Energy, there's a big structural shift as well. So we've seen a number of renewables projects that have structural challenges, and then on the other side, coal and related assets having a problem as well. So I think there's some of the themes we'll see. Probably the big one that's hard to pick is what does travel and leisure look like over the next 18 months. It's still quite hard to pick because no one knows how this unwinds yet.
Brisbane has unfortunately gone into a snap lockdown. Do those lockdowns affect insolvencies, or is it really just I guess, part of the COVID process?
Look, I think at the smaller end of the economy, it absolutely does. Of course, if you're running, a small business in the CBD that's based around having people around, clearly you're impacted, and you don't necessarily have JobKeeper available to you anymore. So I think it will have an impact. Obviously, travel and leisure is another one. I think that the challenge we've seen with travel and leisure, there's no one story. There are many regional assets that are really outperforming. They're doing wonderfully well because of the restrictions that are in place, keeping people local. You see larger assets in some of the CBDs that are actually, much more challenged at the moment. So it's hard to have one answer to that. There's just a lot. I think what's really challenging for operators of those sorts of assets is how do they plan their business? It's very hard to form a view on where they sit right now.
So true. I'm also interested in your perspective on the extended moratorium on insolvent trading rules. Have you seen businesses take advantage of those provisions?
Definitely. So if you look at the period that came through to 1 January, where there was sort of relief, if you like, from insolvent trading, I think absolutely there were companies that would have gone into insolvency if that relief hadn't have been given. And we saw directors relying on that to have the confidence to keep trading whilst they worked out what it all meant for them. So I think we absolutely did see that. Obviously now the government's introduced a new scheme for smaller companies, and they really are, sort of it's $1 million less of creditors, and there are a number of conditions. We haven't seen a great take up at all in that yet. I think part of that might just be awareness. It's going to be interesting. I think we'll see more take up over time. The attitude of the ATO in that process will be interesting, because often they're a significant creditor. So if they're supportive of it, then I think it will gain some more traction. But to date, in the first few months of that regime, there's been very little take up.
As I understand it, the ATO has been fairly relaxed so far in its approach. Do you see them tightening the screws in the future?
I think they'll have to. I mean, they've always been quite supportive. We've seen, companies looking for payment plans, large or small, often getting a good first hearing and getting, a supportive plan. What we tended to see in the past pre-COVID is if you missed that plan and really couldn't negotiate another one, then, the reality of that ATO debt hit. What we've seen during COVID is far more leniency, and that's had a consequence that, effectively the ATO outstanding has gone up. I think they'll have to change tack at some point. I think, that will be gradual. What I think we'll see both from the ATO and banks is companies that were performing well pre-COVID and have been genuinely impacted by COVID. I think there'll continue to be a lot of support. I think that the change we'll start to see is companies that were struggling before COVID anyway are perhaps the ones that are more likely to be exposed by a bit of a hardening around, the activities of people like the ATO.
Similarly, how do you expect the banks to approach restructuring from here?
We've seen this firsthand. During COVID, they've been extremely supportive. Obviously, interest rates are very low. So if you're banking with a traditional senior lender, you have a very low interest rate. They've been very accommodative, particularly, again, if you're a business that was doing well before COVID, they've been extremely supportive. What I think we'll start to see is businesses that had challenges pre-COVID that are in a really tough spot still. I think we'll see banks being a little more front foot around how they engage and try and push through a resolution one way or another, rather than simply, frankly, just sitting back and really not doing a whole lot, which is largely what we've seen since COVID.
Right, we can talk a little bit or more about that later in the session. Andrew, could you give us an overview of LINX so our audience can get a feel for your very, very big and diverse business?
Yes. LINX Cargo Care Group. It's a leading diversified logistics, infrastructure and solutions provider. We operate across 70 sites throughout Australia and New Zealand, and we're across the road, the rail, the ports and forestry operations and businesses. In terms of numbers, LINX Cargo Care, we employ over 3,000 people across Australia and New Zealand. We handle lots of freight. There's 22 million tonnes of bulk cargo, approximately 1.7 million tonnes of steel, and over 17 million tonnes of forestry products. So we do move a lot of product for our customers. We also process approximately 380,000 vehicles for many of the country's largest fleet operators. So quite a diversified logistics operator in the Australian and New Zealand market.
So how did COVID play out for your business?
Yeah, look, in terms of COVID, as we 12 months ago, we started the lockdowns and both across Australia and New Zealand. Impacted, especially in the early days, with New Zealand going into effectively a 5-week lockdown of the country. Because we operate, our core business is in logistics, freight and cargo. We operate in some sectors that were most affected by COVID, given the domestic and international border closures and stay-at-home orders. So from that perspective, impacted from a day-to-day operations. But at the same time, we also had the panic buying, which everyone was well aware of 12 months ago, which did see a heightened demand for some of our services across the logistics, especially here in Australia. But one thing with COVID, it was really through the period of the fluctuating lockdowns over the last 12 months. We've spent a lot of time understanding our customers' positions and how we can help them through COVID. As well as getting an insight as to what the future looks like in terms of different ways of doing business, which I think COVID is really brought out, especially over the last 12 months.
Did you take a special approach to your debtors in light of the special conditions?
I suppose the different approach we took was just really along the collection cycle, getting in early with our customers and just confirming there's no issues with the invoicing. Just speaking to them really and getting a feel that there's no issues along the process, and we expect payments. Obviously, through a period of COVID, communication is the most important. So I think it was that the key was just communicating on a regular basis with our customers to get a feel as to where they're at, both operationally as well as their ability to pay. So it was just really probably focusing more on the communications on a more regular basis.
And where do you see that playing out from here? Do you expect there to be fewer people or fewer businesses that are under the pump?
I think across our portfolio, we see that coming out of COVID, it's going to be a busy time. So it's all about managing managing our customers as well as our expectations, as well as working capital. So it's all about probably keeping close to our customers, making sure that we're delivering to them to enable them to pay our debt. So it's really all about a collaborative communication process and just working with them as we see some positive signs coming out of COVID.
If I can turn to you, Kathy, now. Obviously, you're the absolute expert in restructuring and turnaround. So what are you seeing among your clients?
Look, I think it's really similar to what Pat and Jason have already spoken about around, we did see a reduction in insolvencies through the back end of last year with all the relief measures that were in place. We've come into the new year and arguably, is this the new norm? Who knows? I mean, we say that and then Brisbane hits a snap lockdown. So maybe that new norm does incorporate some level of preparedness for these fluctuations where things might hit. But what I think is going to happen in sort of the year ahead, as we talked about the ATO potentially having to be a little bit more proactive and coming off the level of leniency they had, and the same with the banks and other stakeholders. I think it's a really good landscape for company-led restructuring in the current conditions. So I think we've seen, to Jason's point, where businesses were struggling pre-COVID, and COVID probably and all the relief measures probably gave them a bit of a lifeline to see if they could turn anything around, but maybe that hasn't been successful. I think they're the ones that are likely to lead to the insolvencies that haven't happened. I think if they were good businesses before COVID, but they have suffered and maybe there's a structural change to their revenue, it's a good time, I think, in terms of stakeholder sentiment and the level of liquidity in the market, to take this opportunity to maybe look at cost base, reset where that needs to be based on this new level of revenue, and maybe take advantage of the goodwill of key stakeholders to go through some company-led restructuring. We saw one at the back end of last year that I was involved with, Avado, which was a printing company that used a scheme of company arrangement in quite a novel way to achieve that company side restructuring. Without getting into the nitty-gritty detail of a complex process, I think it's a testament to the fact that it might be a good environment to try and be a bit more creative and proactive in restructuring the business.
So what are the advantages of going down that company-led restructuring path?
I think if you can plan for what you're trying to achieve, you can be proactive with your key stakeholders as a solution and an understanding of what you're bridging to. And sometimes, whether it be the voluntary administration process or a scheme which is more complex, there's a general view that this is, insolvency is bad, it's a terminal outcome. And as an insolvency practitioner, I would say that's not the case, but there are genuine benefits. And I think if you can be proactive, if you can have a plan, if you buy in your stakeholders and try and communicate what you're trying to achieve, I do think there's goodwill and sentiment at the moment. You've got liquidity in the market and people looking for solutions. You've got key stakeholders that don't want to see a tsunami of insolvencies because that's bad for everyone. And so I think if you can get to the front of the queue with your stakeholders and say, here's a solution, you can use those processes to really come through and, as I said, right-size the cost base in reaction to wherever revenue has landed for you and come out stronger than perhaps you were pre-COVID.
I wonder what's circumstances would you go down the voluntary administration path rather than the scheme of arrangement?
Probably most. I mean, schemes of arrangements are they are long, they're complex, there is a level of court involvement. So at the very large end of town, there may be opportunities to use that, and we have seen a few more schemes recently. The voluntary administration process is really a process that is designed to resuscitate where possible. So if directors are facing, you know, that the relief for insolvent trading has come off, if you are looking at your business and thinking you are or you're at risk of becoming insolvent, you can use the voluntary administration process, which at its shortest can be sort of 4 to 6 weeks, to do a deal with creditors and to say we acknowledge there's risk. We're at a turning point. We're on the cusp. Is there scope where we can work with you all and come up with a deal? And that typically leads to what's called a deed of company arrangement. And again, without boring everyone on the call, it's effectively a contractual arrangement with your creditors to try and see the business come out of that process and have a better chance of survival.
Ali, do you mind if I jump in and ask a question just off the back of that? And not to put you on the spot, Kathy or Jason, do you have a sense of how many voluntary administrations would end up as a deed of company arrangement? You know, how I think the fear for small business, and I'm thinking about small and medium businesses rather than larger organisations who I think have the resources in house and they've thought about it a bit more. And you know, I think there's a fear out there, certainly from small businesses, that if I go into voluntary administration, that's it. Like, I'm done.
Yeah, there is some data available because, firstly, ASIC now capture some of that information. So but there is some available, and we obviously look at our own outcomes and put a broad bracket around this because it's an off-the-cuff response to your question. I think it's around 30%. I think the challenge is, for most companies, firstly, when you look at the volume in terms of the number of insolvencies, obviously a lot of companies are 1 or 2 person personal services type companies, and so the reality is it's not necessarily about getting a deed of company arrangement for the corporate entity. It's just about what's the people go and do. So there is an element that you sort of need to acknowledge. It's just that if you look at trading businesses, you know, that have some element of profitability to them, some reason for being, but maybe have gone into an insolvency because they've got a balance sheet problem, or they've got historical losses, or they've got one part of the business that doesn't work. You know, I would say in our experience, more often than not, the outcome is a way forward for that component of the business, whether it's through a sale out of the legal entity, or more often than not now, through a deed of company arrangement. I think Kathy's point around having an end in mind, if you're going into an insolvency process because you need to, have the end in mind. Is there, what's the way forward out of this, and what does that look like? And typically, companies that have gone into the process early enough and have thought about that and planned for it, you know, that's usually an achievable outcome.
Yep. Over to you, Ali. Sorry.
Not at all. So, Jason, companies in that situation, what's the best way they can work with you to get the best outcome possible?
It really is that planning piece and early engagement. I mean, it's very difficult if you're appointed to a company that has no money left, has no goodwill with its creditors left. The options can be very limited. I mean, you're appointed and you become personally liable then for everything you incur. So there is an early engagement piece. It does make sense to engage earlier rather than later. It does increase your options. But also, as I said, have a plan in mind. If the business has got to this point, how did it get there? What can we fix that means that this doesn't happen again? And then how do we take that forward? And I think if you bring that kind of thinking to the situation, you know, as I said, you can get a good outcome.
Kathy, have you got anything you want to add to that part of the discussion?
No, I agree with that. I think the early engagement piece is really around maximising optionality. So the earlier you speak to your advisors, whoever they may be, you have options on the table. I think when you get to the point where, as Jason said, there's really nothing left, it's very hard to then trade the business through to consider options, because it's really there's nothing there to tangibly work with. So I think, you know, engaging early doesn't mean that you're on the cusp of an appointment. It just means we're thinking about options and we can help you navigate those. And in the event that there is a VA option available, to the extent you can plan it and deal with people, you're much more likely to get a better outcome and get through to a DOCA, a deed of company arrangement. And, you know, in our experience, I think to Jason's point, more often than not, that is what we see in the small to medium market, where there is something there and there is a willingness with stakeholders to come to a solution, both creditors, funders, shareholders, whatever that might be, you're much more likely to get a better outcome.
Why don't they engage you early? Are they scared of sort of coming in to talk to you because they think, you know, that's the beginning of the end?
I think there's an element of that. I'd like to think we're not that scary, but certainly in the past, I think the whole industry has been tainted with corporate undertaker sort of sentiment, and that's, you know, not the case. I think there is a fear of, well, if I talk to people, they're minded to just take me down a path, and that's where I go only at the very end when I have no other option and I've tried to fix it all by myself. And I think there has been a shift and an acknowledgement that that's certainly not, that's not what we're here to do. And even in the way we think about it, we do think about it as restructuring. We don't think about it as insolvency and therefore we just want to get an appointment. It's really around, well, how do we restructure? How do we address the problem that you're facing? And is there a mechanism to use the processes we have in Australia to get you through in a structured and permanent way, rather than a bit of an ad hoc, let's buy some time and see if we can kick the can down the road, which may not be sustainable. So hopefully there's an education piece just around, we're not that scary, and it's not a terminal outcome if you do engage with advisors early.
Pat, you've made the comment previously that businesses need to be allowed to fail for the health of the economy. Can you explain the thinking behind that?
Look, it's I didn't do an economics degree, but I think that's kind of economics 101, right? You know, there's risk involved in businesses. Some businesses, well, hopefully, you know, the majority of businesses out there survive, and we know that with a, you know, administration or insolvency rate of 8,000 out of, call it 2 million, 2.5 million businesses. It's a tiny percentage, but ultimately not everyone survives. And the reason they don't is there's plenty of them, right? It can be working capital, cash flow issues. It can be that the director just wants out of the business and they don't, you know, the shareholders don't want to work in it anymore if it's a small business and they're retiring, they're not passing it on, or they just go, you know what, this is really tough. Being a small business owner can be really tough. It's a 24/7 job, and they go, I've had enough. I'm just going to go and get a nice 9-to-5 job and not take my work home with me all the time. So it is important that companies are allowed to fail. If they don't, then, you know, you'll see a whole myriad of issues come into it as people take risks knowing that there's no downside to it, right? So it's sometimes, you know, I feel a bit dark and grim when I talk about that, but I think everyone, you know, understands that certainly is the case. We can't just support struggling businesses forever, because there'll be businesses out there that just shouldn't be allowed to survive ultimately.
And that's just the nature of doing business, isn't it?
That's right.
I can see we've had a couple of questions come through, which we will get to at the end of the session. Just a reminder, if anybody does have any questions for our panelists today, to please pop them in the question box on the webinar form. All right, so Jason, what we talked about the fact that a lot of businesses fail when they're doing really well because they can't manage their working capital. So if your business is in that position, what can you do to manage your cash flow and working capital while you're really busy, and make sure that you don't end up unnecessarily in administration?
Yeah, and look, it's, you know, it's often quite frustrating when you do come on a business that is good fundamentally, but has perhaps made some decisions that have then sort of cast the die in a way that means working capital is getting consumed and they just can't find the funding for it. And in Australia, yeah, there is working capital funding solutions, but they're probably not as extensive as, say, you see in the US market. So when we work with clients around working capital, what we get them to focus on, firstly, is some context. Have a look, if you can, have a look at some of the competitors in your sector and what are they achieving. and understand what a day's sales outstanding, what a day's purchases outstanding, a day's inventory. What's that worth to you in dollars? Because that's an easy calculation to do. And get a sense of the opportunity. If I can achieve what the best in my sector is doing, that will release X dollars into my business. And I think that's a really tangible way for businesses to start thinking about how important is working capital management to me, what's the size of the prize. So I'd encourage people to do that. The other thing we do with clients is really pull apart the path from effort or sale to dollar in the bank, and understand that step, and not just at a theoretical level, follow it through in a real way. Go back 12 months, 6 months, and have a look at how that has worked. And we often use analytics to do that for companies, and understand what are the delays between effort or sale and dollar in the bank, and do a sort of root cause analysis and try and get rid of all the roadblocks you can. Probably the final thing I'd say is that there is a bit in the setup. Obviously, every sector is different, but we often see the problem has been made right at the start of the customer relationship, where not a lot of thought was given to the working capital component of the relationship, whatever that might look like in terms of when you're allowed to bill or how you bill. It's not just how many days on the invoice you're giving them. Really think about that and try and set yourself up to succeed in working capital when you start the customer engagement piece. Make that as equal a priority as how many sales am I going to get and what margin am I going to get. And I think companies will see a big shift if they take those kind of initiatives.
What's coming to sort of back to the financing side of it, what is the appetite among banks versus non-banks and more alternative funding sources to get involved here?
Yeah, obviously this has been very topical with what's been happening with Green Seal. I think we've seen in Australia the banks have the typical, the traditional banks have come in and out a little bit of working capital orientated funding, but most of them are there at the moment. So they would typically have some kind of factoring product, what's broadly called asset-backed lending. So rather than just looking at your cash flow or your property, they look at, well, your invoices and your inventory, for example, and I will fund X% of that. So those products are out there. There are other providers as well, other non-bank providers providing those facilities. So there are options out there. One thing we do say to clients is you really got to understand those products, because they're great. They can be very good at improving cash flow. So they're well worth exploring and a great way to get funding into your business. The challenge, of course, is you're really bringing forward your working capital. So if anything goes wrong, it hits you very quickly, because obviously you've been paid today, for example, for invoices that otherwise paying for 60 days. And if something goes wrong, that can eat cash very, very quickly. So we always warn people in using those products to make sure they understand the risks and what it means for their business.
Are there funding structures that are emerging in more sophisticated markets like the US that we're yet to see here?
Yeah, we see it, and the market's just not as deep. And it really is that story around asset-backed lending. So, how rather than say getting debt funding at 3 times my EBITDA number, which is typically what you'd see a traditional bank approach being here, you're instead saying, well, I've got debtors of this value, I've got inventory of this value. A bank or other financiers teaming up with valuers, for example, to get comfort around that, and then lending a percentage against that, kind of asset-based lending. As I said, there is some of that here. It's not that it's not here, and we are seeing some of the offshore providers actually have a greater presence here offering that product as well. But it certainly is more in its infancy, whereas you would see, for example, in the United States, that's quite a common way of funding companies, particularly in companies that have narrow margins, lots of working capital. So retail can be active in that space, even things like construction, second-tier contractors.
So what's your message?
Sorry. I just wanted to ask the CFO in the room here, has off the back of the funding discussion now, has COVID sort of got you thinking from a different perspective around funding? And obviously, we don't know what your funding is. You're obviously a large organisation, but has it sort of changed your mindset or forced you to go and look elsewhere for something different or cheaper or just alternative?
No, we haven't sort of changed our focus or our strategy regarding funding with COVID. We're with traditional banks, and they've been very supportive. So from our perspective, there's been no real change. But we are very sharpened in terms of the focus on working capital and the collection of our customer invoices. That is, I suppose, over the last 12 months, it's been a real sharpened focus for the organisation to free up cash flow from that perspective.
And does that, being a larger organisation, does it give you an opportunity to sort of not take advantage of smaller businesses, but to take advantage of the market conditions because you've got that probably access to cheaper funding? Access to funding is part of the story, but in terms of it's having a balanced approach, both with our suppliers and customers, and it's obviously doing the right thing, but as well as having that balanced approach, and making sure you've got the appropriate terms on both the customer and the supplier side to manage working capital appropriately.
Kathy, obviously we're living in an extraordinarily low interest rate environment, but that won't last forever. So how will any rise in interest rates affect businesses' ability to pay their obligations?
I mean, I think they're so low at the moment that they've got to go a fair way before the pinch point starts to hit. But I mean, it's obviously unique to everyone's individual circumstances. I think that there has been growth in that non-bank lending market, and so there obviously those rates aren't as low as sort of the big four probably are sitting at the moment. So I do think there may well be some pain to be felt. I think it depends on how businesses have viewed or have understood the future in terms of where they're borrowing at. So if it's just a short-term view of I've got access to capital now, it's cheap, I'm going to go for it and hope for the best, I think it may well be that's where the pressure hits, because it doesn't take much of an increase to maybe expose that they've drawn down too much or sort of taken access to what's out there. But I think, if you're in the world where you're saying I'm going to try and lock in some arrangements now where interest rates are low and manage that in a conservative way, I think there's still opportunity. But they are just so low at the moment and there's so much liquidity in the market, I think it's going to take some movement before that really starts to bite.
We now might turn to some of the questions that have come in during the call. So I'll pose these questions to either you, Jason, or Kathy. The first question is, what should the underlying message to credit managers be coming out of a COVID period? Is it hold and stay supportive or prepare for an economic downturn?
I think it's understand your counterparty, really, because I don't think it's one or the other. I think as credit managers, they're all very well placed to know who they're dealing with, and it's going the step beyond your business and into the next and having a view on what you think is happening in their business to have that appropriate decision. So again, I think that's what brings me back to my earlier point about engaging early with your stakeholders. If your credit manager, the credit manager of your customers, knows what's happening, is aware, there is a better relationship, there's more ability to understand, am I supporting them through to something? So I don't know that there's a one size fits all, but I do think it's on high alert to understand who your counterparties are and try and think about what their plan is.
And check their credit reports.
I echo that. I think I'd probably come at the mindset. Obviously, there are sectors that really haven't been that affected by COVID, and it kind of is what it is. But I think if you think through your counterparty, and they've either not been impacted by COVID in a positive way, or in fact maybe have been helped by it, I think you've got to come with a mentality that it's probably as good as it gets right now. As we've talked about, the tide's going out in terms of all the support. So if you've got a counterparty that's got some challenges now, unless there's a very industry specific reason, it's probably unlikely that things are going to get better for them over the balance of the year unless there's some sort of micro reason for it. So I think that's probably the mentality that I'd bring if I was a credit manager is things probably get harder rather than easier from here.
Another question for the McGrath-Nicol team. How do we assist our small business customers to get through this difficult period?
You go first, Kath.
Who's taking it? It's, you know, at a space level, it's a similar response. I think, you know, assistance comes from understanding the position that they're in, and again, having a view into what you're assisting through to. So I know that at the very small business end, and I think Pat mentioned this earlier on, you know, some livelihoods are on the line because people have provided personal guarantees. They are personally vested in their business. It's make or break. And, you know, if there is a world in which, depending on what industry they're in and their personal circumstances, there is an articulation of, I just need help to get through, because if these three things can fall in line, here's what it looks like for me, and I can see that, I just need to bridge my way through it. Then, you know, obviously stakeholders can support. I think where it gets difficult as a stakeholder to support businesses is when you can't understand what it is you're bridging to, and if it's just sort of tipping into a hole where there's been challenges and it's I just need more. And, you know, it's the famous old line, hope's not a strategy. And sometimes I think if people can't articulate what it is that they want the support for, that are sort of saying, but I'm here and I really need your help and I'd appreciate it, it becomes more challenging. And so maybe the support comes in the form of the advice, and that sort of, if you can tell me what you're bridging to, I can help you, rather than a straight out financial outcome.
And recommending like a third party to assist with that as well, right? Because the majority of small business owners are never an expert in credit management or finance or cash flow or anything like that. They're great with their product. They're great at sales and marketing, and maybe, you know, the operation side of things, but, you know, they don't know how to, you know, operate Excel, you know, simple things that an accountant or a specialist can look at and go, hey, actually, you've got all of this, you know, capital locked up here, like Jason was talking about, in terms of, you know, their receivables, or, you know, you're wasting money over here. You know, there's actually a really nice way to free something up here and get you to that destination that you can see. I think small business owners, they're afraid to ask for help sometimes, or they don't have time. They're in their business.
Or money. So I think that the general sense is, I'm really up against it. Things are very tight. I can't afford an advisor at the moment. I've just got to muddle through. But I think it's an acknowledgement that the advisor will bring value, whether it is unlocking capital within your business, whether it's helping you try and come up with a solution, whether it's managing risk because you are personally exposed. And you know, I think there is value that can come. It's just that when you're at the tough end of town and you're managing 20 different things and everyone's coming at you, it's hard to have that clarity of thought that says, well, if I invest in some good advice, it's going to help.
Pat, I'm not sure if this is a question for you or not. I understand ASIC keeps stats on each type of external administration, but don't link them. Therefore, is it unknown how many VAs move into Dockers and how many Dockers deed of company arrangements succeed or move to liquidation? Have you got any insight into that?
So as I asked the question earlier about the percentage, I vaguely remembered that ASIC they've obviously published quite a bit, and credit to them, they've started publishing a lot more through COVID as a result of probably journalists inundating them with questions. But I have a feeling they do actually publish the results of those and the types of administrations. I don't think they would link them from one to another, so you'd have to put some assumptions in there. But as soon as this is done, I'll be jumping on it because it's a favorite link in my Chrome.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think really recently, Kath, you back me up on this. I think maybe in the last, probably as you say, in response to COVID, they have started collecting some extra data when we report to them, as we have to, around appointments, and we now report more specifically around the outcome of a voluntary administration in a way that I think means they'll probably be able to report that better going forward than as you say, in the past, they haven't really linked them. It's just overall numbers.
a specific question for you, Jason. You mentioned that leaving it late in the piece makes it hard to engage a registered liquidator as they take on liabilities post-engagement. A key aspect of the reforms for small business was to retain the liability with directors. Does this change the capacity of registered liquidators to support small business restructures?
It does. I think it's going to be really interesting because at the end of the day, of course, the liability has to sit somewhere. So either in the old environment, and frankly still in the current environment, other than for small companies, it sits with the administrator. And so you turn to the suppliers, to the business and the employees, and say, well, you know, you will get paid going forward because I'm very focused on making sure there are assets to do that. Otherwise, it's my assets. And people take comfort from that, and it's very unusual that we don't get a continuation of supply if we want to keep the business going because of that. So the proposition now under the small business rules is that stays with the company, but of course that's a very different proposition to the suppliers to that company because they run the risk that not only have they lost what they're owed today, but they're continuing to supply and they're not going to get paid for that either. So I think what's going to be interesting is how that dynamic plays out. Certainly, it makes it easier for the company to choose to continue trading and try and find a solution. But of course, that's contingent on the suppliers continuing to support it and being willing to take that risk. And I think it's too early to say how the market generally is going to respond to that proposition.
A question for you, Andrew. This audience member was interested in your balanced approach. What tools do you use to ensure your customers meet payment terms, and what's your first action when a payment is missed?
Well, look, the tools we use is across normal collection activities, phone calls, directly with the customer representatives, both on the customer side as well as the company side. If things are not coming to a landing where it's an appropriate outcome in terms of the cash being received, sometimes I get involved in sort of finance to finance discussions. Generally, you get the right outcome there. And then if we need to advance it further, well, obviously there begins sort of letters and legal processes. But to be honest, they're few and far between. We generally, across the different opportunities that we have through the business as well as through our collections, as well as ultimately myself, we seem to get the right outcome.
Right. A final question before we wrap up, because we're coming up to the hour. What company size, as in business size, are mostly failing in today's market?
Sorry, I just had to move then because my computer was about to run out of battery. I might take that one. I think we're certainly going to see. Look, at the end of the day, small businesses make up 90, depending on where you look, it could be 90, it could be 98% of all businesses out there. So we will certainly see small businesses affected. More so than anyone else. Plus, there's the additional pressures of, we've been talking about financing and cash flow. It's very hard for small businesses, even in boom times, to get access to the sort of capital that they require without, putting more of their house up as collateral. So I think we're certainly going to see small businesses hurt more. So the second part of the question was that industry related, Ali?
Oh, no, just what company sizes in employee size are failing in today's market. So I think.
Yeah, that's probably it.
Great. All right, to wrap up today's session, which has been absolutely fascinating, I'll start with you, Kathy. How do you see your work playing out over the course of the year? I imagine you'll be extremely busy.
I'm too scared to say that because that's what we thought around this time last year, and for all the right reasons we weren't. So that's not a bad outcome. I think there will be a pickup. I'm hopeful that there will be a pickup not hopeful there'll be a pickup in insolvency, but I think in terms of, as I said, the company-led restructuring opportunities, I think working with businesses across all sizes to come up with some solutions. And I think, to Jason's point, it's probably been the best it will be for a while in terms of the level of support and more broadly the sentiment around keeping things going. And as that tails back, as the ATO becomes a little bit more aggressive and returns back to its normal position, as banks do the same, I do think there will be an increase in activity, which, you know, I think will make us, we'll see an increase in activity over the back end of the year.
What about you, Jason? What do you think the major challenges for the economy are from here?
Yeah, I think it's that confidence and that really taking those steps to resize. It is expensive in Australia. I mean, most business costs, leases and people and redundancy costs, many businesses do look forward to a different operating mode given what's happened. You know, taking that step, what's the plan? How are we going to get ourselves competitive again? How are we going to fund that? And what's the best way to achieve it? I think that's the challenge that a lot of companies are going to have to face that maybe didn't have to over the last 12 months because of the support that they had.
And Andrew, I can't resist but ask you about the situation in the Suez. Is that just a short-term blip? What's the ramifications of that?
Oh, look, it's good that the Ever Given is now sailing, so that's a positive. Look, the backlog will take, you know, reading in the press, you know, 3 to 5 days to clear. But I think the impact from a supply chain perspective before it gets back to normal will be weeks. You know, shipping schedules are probably thrown into disarray for the last 2 weeks or so. So it'll take some weeks to get back to normal. So if you probably ordered a lounge or you're about to order a lounge, you may need to allow an extra couple of weeks.
Finally, Pat, where to from here for Creditor Watch?
Look, I think 2020 I got sick of talking about the negative side of things, and I know that's just the reality of it. You know, the global pandemic, you know, companies under a lot of stress, just, you know, every facet of life really, except for a number of very lucky companies out there that have been mentioned plenty of times over the last 12 months, e-commerce. I think consistency is the key word for 2021. I think if we can consistently keep borders open, we can stay on top of outbreaks. You know, fingers crossed that, you know, it only ends up being a 3-day lockdown in Brisbane. I think if we can be able to plot a road back to normal and not have any major you know, events or lockdowns or, you know, anything like that, and, you know, it just gives people the confidence to invest, to hire, to pay their bills on time. You know, really simple things going, I'd rather hold on to that for an extra couple of days because I'm waiting for someone else to pay me who's holding on for an extra couple of days. You know, we just get that real nice consistent liquidity back as well. You know, Australia will be absolutely flying, and I think that'll give firms the opportunity to sort of take advantage of you know, prevailing winds in the economy. And yeah, we are going to be the poster child of opening back up, despite the fact that, you know, the vaccination will probably be a bit behind everyone else. And I know from an international borders perspective, we'll probably be a lot more conservative than other places. But I think you know, you talk to people overseas and they can't get their head around what we're going through, and you know, to be honest, we can't get our head around what they're going through. So consistency and positivity going forward is what we're looking forward to.
That's great. Well, I'd like to finish by thanking all our panelists for their fantastic insights today, and everybody watching as well. Apologies for going a few minutes over. So we'll be back with more great webinars, and I hope everyone enjoys their Easter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ali, as well, for moderating.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, right.